This is a brief overview of World War One and how it reshaped gender roles fundamentally in European culture and society, and especially in France. Now, World War One, which lasted 4 years between 1914 and 1918, marked the end of the 19th century and opened the 20th century, resonating long after its end. It began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo, Serbia, on June 28, 1914, and most countries mobilized swiftly in the following days. Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia then declared war on Austria, Germany sided with Austria, while France supported Serbia. And because Germany invaded France through neutral Belgium, this pulled Great Britain into the war on France's side. So the World War One had two major fronts: the Western Front, through Belgium and northern France, where trench warfare characterized the fighting, and the Eastern Front, which stretched from Estonia in the Baltic to Albania in southern Europe. But the fighting also spread to the Ottoman Empire, Africa, and the Middle East. And in fact, many of the Western European colonial powers, like France and England, were also colonial powers, and they mobilized millions of African and South Asian subjects to come and fight this war on European soil for them. So the World War One was unforeseen, new, because it instantiated a new type of incredibly destructive warfare, and it was a global conflict. So the war front inaugurated a new type of fighting. Battles lasted for months. They proved bloody, leaving millions dead and even more wounded. For instance, in the Battle of the Somme, which lasted 5 months, more than 1 million French, British, and German soldiers died. The average survival of a gunner was half an hour. And new technologies proved even deadlier than before. There was the increased use of machine gun, and which means that infantry battles now proved deadly. The use of bombs, which was novel, which devastated the countryside and mutilated and killed men. But also the use of chemical warfare, the use of mustard gas and other very deadly gas, which left burning skin, and also all forms of unforeseen wounds and deaths. And finally, trench warfare, where men would sit for months in deep trenches, in the cold, in the mud, amidst the sound of bombs falling and machine guns, waiting and fearing chemical attacks, and sometimes not able to move further than a couple of 100 meters. Now, this had a huge impact on gender roles because the war seemed to destroy what most people assumed to be the foundations of masculinity. That is, war was a heroic affair where one would prove one's worth. Instead, you had millions of wounded and mutilated men who came back and were now unproductive citizens who could no longer work. There was also the emergence of a new phenomenon that was called shell shock or male hysteria, and that we would now call PTSD. But men were not the only ones caught by the war. Women who stayed on the home front were also directly affected. For instance, invasion separated families, and women were left off to fend off by themselves, having to earn an income because fathers, brothers, husbands, boyfriends were on the home front for years at a time. And women were also involved in different but crucial ways on the war front. What we see is female nurses entering combat zone, and in fact a huge number of casualties required a continual supply of medical personnel. Now, at first, governments resisted putting women close to the fighting, or sending female doctors to supervise men, or even female nurses. But women went of their own initiative in combat zone, and indeed nurses were crucial to women's survival. On the home front too, what we see is how war affected gender roles and people's lives, because it affected civilian life. Daily life radically changed because governments monitored residents' movements, their correspondence, their food consumption, and their speech with curfews and national conscriptions for women. They began issuing passports for resident aliens. And in fact, the practice of the passport comes after World War I. But at the same time, patriotism really inspired women to volunteer. Women knitted socks, assembled first aid kits, sent care packages to the front. In Germany, a year of women's service was promoted. So what you have is a mobilization of men on the war front and the mobilization of women on the home front. Now, women were first affected by control and rationing, and especially when men had been drafted. In Austria, the government conscripted 60% of the male population between 18 and 53. And in fact, Austrian women remember waiting in line for potatoes all day during the winter. And working women had to bear the brunt of the effects of rationing. As the war progressed, bread riots and demonstrations broke out. And this is especially striking in Berlin, in Germany, for instance, where more than 700,000 women and men died of malnutrition by the end of the war. And in fact, when women demonstrated against food shortage, police were unable or unwilling to arrest these women because they knew full well the difficulties these women faced and how these women themselves invoked patriotic language to legitimate their demonstrations. And another massive change took place in the workforce. Mass mobilization and conscription led many factories and many employers to replace the male workforce with women. The British government, for instance, demanded that the manufacturing of shells be performed by a labour force of 80% of women. By 1916, the German General Staff passed a law permitting the conscription of women into the industrial workforce. So women worked on railroads, in factories, in mines, as trucks and bus drivers. In Russia, for instance, the proportion of women in industry expanded from 1914 to 1917 from 26% to 43%. In Britain and France, the war shifted the nature of women's work away from domestic work towards industry. In fact, by 1918, 1 million British women worked in munitions factories alone. And the number of working women who were married drastically increased because often wives replaced their husbands in the very jobs they had performed. For instance, 20% of German women working on streetcars were replacing their husband. So you have to think about the fact that suddenly you have a huge amount of women in the workforce in jobs that were traditionally seen and were masculine or performed by men. At the same time, there was a very ambivalent relationship to this change. Male unions were unhappy about this shift and prevented women from earning equal pay or taking these jobs permanently. And this caused a lot of anxiety, while at the same time, both employers and union making sure that women were paid half or sometimes a third of men's wages. And that shift of women to the workforce caused even more anxiety when countries, societies, governments saw men returning from the front, wounded, shell-shocked, alienated from civilian lives. At the same time, there was increased government involvement in citizens' daily lives, which came in the form of increased surveillance in the name of national union to support the war effort. For instance, in England, single women received special scrutiny because they were seen as having more disposable income, and because of the nature of having to work, were seen more often in public. England restricted women's drinking in bars and established earlier curfews for women than men. Now, anxieties meant that governments passed new series of laws, both providing for women and regulating women's sexuality. French governments, French legislatures legalized marriage by proxy and the posthumous legitimation of children whose fathers had died fighting for France. In Germany, the government asked women to cut their hair in order to use it to make belts because of lack of supplies. So the sacrifice of femininity for the war effort still created anxieties about the ways in which the war seemed to have masculinized women. Hair was cut, hands were raised in order to facilitate working in factories because cloth was in short supply, revealing women's legs, and in order to work with brutal industrial rhythms, women also started wearing trousers to facilitate this. At the same time, you have to contrast this to images that came back of wounded soldiers that seem to have been emasculated and made effeminate. In fact, it's important to remember that by 1916, as many as 40% of casualties in all of the combat zones suffered from shell shock. In 1918, in Britain alone, more than 20 military hospitals were devoted to treating shell-shocked soldiers. And this was shocking for women too. And to add to anxiety and ambivalence, nationalist patriotic rhetoric and propaganda was often couched in clear gendered terms, and war was fought using the language of gender. Propaganda celebrated male heroism and virile masculinity. Enemy nations were portrayed as sexual predators with the metaphor of rape. And in fact, the vulnerable family headed by vulnerable women and children was also very much present. And yet, in direct contrast to the actual experiences of men and women on the war front and on the home front. This was World War I, and it would have long-lasting effects on the 1920s and the 1930s and what we call the post-war and the interwar period.